Welcome. Okay, you've sent over some really interesting stuff this time. We've got articles, blogs,
Yeah, including some pretty thought-provoking material from Samuel Twommen's archives and also a report from Newsweek.
and the core idea, the really surprising part, is this possibility that President Trump, Mr. America First, might actually be considering some kind of link with the British Commonwealth.
Right, and maybe even involving King Charles III in some kind of nominal role over the U.S.
Yeah.
It's a genuinely head-turning idea.
Especially, like you said, given his whole anti-globalist patriot image.
Exactly. So our goal here, our deep dive, is really to unpack these claims, which seem pretty surprising on the surface. We need to look at the context, figure out what's really being suggested, and what the key takeaways might be for you.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Samuel Twommen mentions something interesting, Trump's seeming admiration for the English royals, particularly King Charles.
Yeah, he calls it a peculiar idolization, which seems about right given their, very different political stances. Twommen even mentioned an old blog post wondering if Charles had somehow, enchanted Trump when they first met.
It's just unexpected, isn't it?
It is. And what's also fascinating, and maybe a key thing for you to notice here, is how selective Trump's praise seems to be.
Ah, right. He's not keen on all of them.
Not at all. He's been very critical, publicly, of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. They're often seen as more aligned with, let's say, progressive ideas.
Hmm.
But then he has generally positive things to say about other royals, including the king.
Which Twommen connects to the history in England, where traditionally opposition to the monarchy came more from the left, correct?
Exactly. So that pattern kind of holds, in a way.
Okay. And speaking of the king, while Queen Elizabeth II was famously, politically neutral,
Scrupulously so.
it seems King Charles III might be a bit different, more politically active.
That's a really important point for you to grasp, I think.
Mm.
Charles isn't necessarily playing the same politically neutral role his mother did. There was that BBC documentary, The Meddling Prince,
Oh,
the whole
yeah.
Black Spider memos thing. Those really showed his history of, privately lobbying UK government ministers on quite a range of topics.
And he seems pretty active on the world stage, too, maybe even more so.
Absolutely. If you look at the bigger picture, he's given keynote speeches at major global events, like the Paris Climate Conference back in 2015.
Where he was really pushing for countries to sign the agreement.
He was. And then, fast forward to the World Economic Forum in 2020, he was there talking about climate change, framing it from the perspective of younger generations and calling for a, quote, revolutionary change to our economic model.
And that's where the connection to the Great Reset comes in, right? Which is this, sometimes controversial idea about restructuring the global economy.
Precisely. An idea that, as Tuominen notes, some people interpret as leading towards a, let's just say, less than desirable future.
And wasn't there also something about a coalition of the willing at the G7?
Yes, in 2021, promoting his Terra Carta climate initiative with CEOs from some huge global companies.
Right. And then that reported secret meeting in 2022 with American CEOs, bank executives, pushing ESG goals.
Mm-hmm. Environmental, social, and governance goals. Basically, criteria for ethical investing, which interestingly got a very strong reaction from Elon Musk,
Who's now working with Trump, yeah.
who called ESG woke capitalism, and I think the quote was the devil incarnate or something like that.
Wow, okay. So this brings us to the central puzzle here, right? For you listening, how do we square this? Trump, the America First guy?
Right. Pulled out of the Paris Agreement, calls climate change initiatives a globalist scam, very anti-woke.
And yet he seems to admire King Charles, who is, deeply involved in all those things, global agendas, climate action, ESG.
It just doesn't seem to fit, does it? It looks like a major contradiction. Why the admiration?
It really does. Okay, let's bring Canada into this weird mix. Trump has floated the idea before, making Canada the 51st state.
He has. And Tolman looked at that through a few lenses. Was it a joke? Was Trump just, trolling people?
Or maybe a negotiation tactic.
Possibly. All within that Make America Great Again
Yeah.
framework. And, historically, the U.S. has expanded its territory.
So it sort of fits the brand, in a way.
It could, but the really interesting part for you here is the reported reaction from King Charles, because he's also Canada's monarch, remember? Part of the Commonwealth.
Right, and he wasn't happy.
Tuominen says the idea of annexing Canada actually angered the king.
Okay, which then leads to this truly astonishing claim Tuominen reports, a potential compromise.
Yeah, this is where it gets really wild. The suggestion, apparently, is that maybe Trump could take Canada
Okay.
And in return, Charles would somehow take the United States.
Wow.
This
Whoa.
Tuominen admits that might not be the exact wording, but it gives you a sense of the kind of almost unbelievable discussion that might be floating around.
It's like a complete reversal of 1776 almost. The key thing for you here is just how strange this idea is, suggesting maybe some really unusual thinking about power dynamics.
Absolutely. And then we have something a bit more concrete, Trump's post on Truth Social.
Right, this was reported by Newsweek. It was a response to an article in the Sun newspaper, wasn't it? About Charles supposedly making a secret offer for the U.S. to join the Commonwealth as an associate member.
Exactly. And Trump's response, direct quote, "I love King Charles. Sounds good to me."
Which, I mean, seems to add some fuel to this fire, however unlikely the whole thing sounds.
It certainly makes you pause, doesn't it?
It does. So maybe we should quickly explain, for you listening, what exactly is the Commonwealth?
Sure. So basically, it's an organization mostly made up of former British colonies or territories, places that gained independence, largely around the mid-20th century when the empire was dissolving. And what's interesting here, as Newsweek points out, is that maybe joining the Commonwealth could be a different kind of international engagement for Trump, compared to, say, his skepticism towards NATO or the UN.
So a different flavor of international group.
Sort of. But it's important for you to understand it's mainly a symbolic association now. It doesn't really have major binding political or economic power over its members.
And the Daily Mail suggested maybe there were more practical reasons, too. Strengthening the U.S.-UK special relationship. Maybe avoiding those threatened tariffs on steel and aluminum.
That's definitely part of the speculation. So while joining might seem largely symbolic.
Yeah, it doesn't automatically change how the U.S. is governed.
Right. But the underlying worry, which Tuominen brings up, is whether it could somehow make Charles the nominal monarch of the U.S., even just symbolically.
And that raises big questions for you, doesn't it, given how different their politics seem? Could Charles use that symbolic influence in ways that clash with Trump's agenda?
That's the concern, especially when you factor in reports about Charles's own views on America, which haven't always been flattering.
Right. His biographer, Robert Jobson, apparently wrote that Charles has a deep distrust of the U.S. So the key thing for you is just how jarring this potential alliance seems.
It really is. And Jobson detailed quite a range of criticisms attributed to Charles. Things like U.S. policy in the Middle East, the U.S. reluctance, especially under Trump, to sign climate change deals.
He was horrified by U.S. farming practices, too, apparently. Worries about animal welfare, the environment.
Yes, and Jobson even quoted someone close to Charles saying the prince finds the large number of fundamentalist Christians in the U.S. deeply worrying.
And Tuominen points out a really stark comparison, noting Charles's environmental views aren't miles away from comments Osama bin Laden made about the U.S. in the Kyoto Protocol.
It's a provocative comparison, certainly.
And there was also that mention of a letter from Charles back in 1986, apparently expressing disappointment about inaction against the Jewish lobby in the U.S.
All of which adds, significant layers of complexity for you to think about when considering Trump maybe aligning the U.S., even symbolically, with King Charles.
Unsurprisingly, Trump's base. They weren't exactly thrilled with this Commonwealth idea, were they?
No, not at all. The reaction from Magier's supporters seems to have been overwhelmingly negative. That's putting it mildly.
You saw comments online like, hell no, people bringing up 1776, escaping tyranny.
Right. And lots of concern about Charles being a globalist tied to the World Economic Forum. One person even warned Trump he could lose like 95% of his support over this.
And figures like Alex Jones weighed in pretty heavily, too.
Oh, yeah. Very strong warnings. Jones apparently said something like 1776 will commence again if Trump actually tried to make the U.S. join the Commonwealth. He saw it as a total betrayal.
It really highlights that deep-seated opposition, doesn't it? Especially in Trump's space, to anything resembling a link back to the British monarchy.
Absolutely. Now, flipping back to Charles's side.
Yeah.
There's also this idea that he's been thinking about changing the monarch's role for a while.
Ah, okay. How so?
Well, there was a report back in 2008 in the Guardian newspaper. It talked about plans in Charles's inner circle to kind of nudge the monarchy towards being more active.
More active how?
The idea was maybe Charles could speak on big international stages, like the European Parliament, or even potentially the U.S. Congress. An activist king. That was the phrase used. And the concern raised back then was, could this lead to an abuse of power? Could it damage the monarchy if his opinions were unpopular or, worse, ridiculed?
You can just imagine the scene, can't you? King Charles, maybe as nominal U.S. head of state, addressing Congress and then criticizing the president's climate policy.
Exactly. Tuominen even sketched out a funny hypothetical Truth Social post from Trump, absolutely losing it in that scenario.
So even if Charles has diplomatic skills, and he does seem to have them,
Definitely. We should acknowledge that.
his recent speeches in Italy, France, Germany, apparently delivering parts in their own languages, that shows some real diplomatic effort, right? Linguistic skill.
It does.
Mhm.
It shows he's thinking strategically, engaging seriously with other nations. He's not just a passive figurehead. He seems to be actively shaping his role.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive for you, the really surprising core here is Trump, the nationalist icon, potentially cozying up to King Charles and the Commonwealth. It just seems so counterintuitive.
That's the main tension for you to keep thinking about. This huge contradiction between Trump's very loud anti-globalist stance and his apparent openness to linking up with someone like Charles, who embodies a lot of that global agenda and reportedly holds some pretty critical views of the U.S.
Which leads us to that final thought for you. Given everything American independence, the clashing ideologies, the backlash, we're already seeing what could possibly be the real motivation behind these talks. Even if it ends up being purely symbolic, what might the long-term ripple effects be, politically, culturally, for American identity itself?
Yeah, it's definitely something to mull over, a lot to unpack there.
It certainly is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.